You're listening to the 95 podcast from the team at 95 Network, where we host conversations specifically designed to support leaders in small and mid-sized churches.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the 95 podcast. This is Dale Sellers, Executive Director of 95 Network. I hope you're having a great summer. I know we just completed doing our podcast recast in the month of July, and now we've begun to do some new live podcasts. I want to tell you up front, if you are listening to this podcast that we're going to do today, and you have little ones with you, whether you're in the car or just in the house listening, the subject matter will not be appropriate for them today. So I want to let you know that up front, so you could maybe shoo them off or get them playing or somewhere or listen to this in a different time, because we're going to talk about a subject that's really affecting the world, but specifically it has an impact in the church. And so just wanted you to know that up front, that disclaimer that this will not be a good podcast for kids to listen to. Today I have with me Hannah Ashwell, and she is in the UK. And some of you will remember recently, back in June, we had John Finkeldy on, and he was in Australia. So anytime I get to have somebody on who has a real accent, I love it. Hannah, how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm great. Thanks, Dale. It's amazing to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, we do have friends, Lee Button and Chris Bright, who are in the UK, and so it's so fun when we get a chance to talk to you guys, because you guys really know how to talk well. I think when we get to heaven, we're probably going to have your accent. I know we're not going to have the Southern accent from South Carolina.
Oh, who
So
knows?
take a moment and just kind of let us get to know you a little bit, and then we'll kind of dive into our subject matter. But I just want to get to know you a little bit before we do.
Right. Okay. So I'm Hannah and I live in the UK, as you've already heard. I am a PhD psychology student, specifically looking at trauma. And I'm also a therapist. And my kind of area of expertise is what I call modern day addictions.
Hmm.
So things really that affect people that aren't necessarily our classic addictions like alcohol and drugs. It's more to do with things like pornography and sex addiction, gambling, and issues around food and eating, and either calorie restrictive behavior or over consuming of ultra processed foods and the things that lead up to those behaviors, really.
Well, you've already got me interested. And honestly, we're going to spend today talking about the effects of pornography. And especially if it's a pastor, I want to say this to you. We've done some podcasts in the past about pornography, but it was specifically about pastors or ministry people being involved. Hannah's subject is broader. She and I talked a few days ago, and honestly, one of the things that she helped me remember and just bring to the forefront is that we have an entire generation of people in our churches who have viewed pornography and just at every day with their phones, with on the internet. And there's a huge effect that you're going to have to deal with if you pastor a church. And some pastors answer to everything, so I'll pray about that. And prayer is great. We're not knocking prayer, but there's a whole lot more to be involved, to talk about. So kind of dive into it. Before we get into the pornography, I'm still interested in the food part. So kind of talk to me a little bit about food addiction before we get into that, because that'll minister to the pastors probably more.
It is actually, I mean, it's a real issue. And again, very similarly to pornography, it's very stigmatized and it's very contentious. And, I know from my own personal experience, when I was a very, very unhealthy weight, being underweight, nobody knew what to say about it, but people would tell me that if I went home and prayed over my dinner, then God would make me better. And then similarly, I was actually on the border of being morbidly obese about 5 years ago due to some issues that I was going through. And that was kind of how I was coping with it. And not one person asked me if I was okay or said anything or was willing to address it. Because it's seen as quite a rude thing, isn't it? You wouldn't go up to say to somebody and say, "Hey, you're really fat. What's the problem?" But actually, there's always an issue behind these behaviors, whatever the behavior is. There's always an underlying reason, and we need to be equipped to support people through these kinds of things.
You've studied this for a while now, so kind of walk us through what led you to study this, and then we'll see how we can begin to relate to some things.
Yeah, so I was a therapist on and off for quite a long time, went off and had another career, had children, and kind of dipped in and out a little bit. And then just before COVID, I saw an advert for a post-qualifying diploma in porn and sex addiction. And straight away, I thought, that is amazing. And I hadn't done any research about it or anything. And then it wasn't until about a year and a half later that I was really fortunate enough to be able to do the course. And on our first day of training, in the very, very first lesson, we were asked, how much porn is too much porn? Now, when you're looking at it from an addiction point of view
Hmm.
and a compulsive behavior point of view, you will have a threshold which dictates that's too much, that's a problem. But actually, as a Christian, it's the minute that thought and that desire comes into your head,
Hmm.
that's where the problem starts. And clinically, it's very difficult to get help for somebody who doesn't meet the diagnostic criteria for having an addiction or having a compulsive behavior problem. So, my work really is very much based on you don't have to be an addict to want to be free.
That threshold, I'm interested in that. I mean, is it like how many hours you watch, or how do they determine that?
So it's based on really the diagnostics around addiction. Is it something that is becoming a life controlling issue? Are you choosing that over spending time with friends or eating or are you doing it a certain number of times a day or a week? I can't actually remember what the diagnostic criteria is for pornography, but I know, for instance, with something like binge eating, you have to have done it so many times over a period of 7 to 10 days.
Uh-huh.
So obviously, if you're only doing it once every 2 weeks, but it's still impacting and you want to get free from it, you can't actually get the help until you meet that criteria. So my real kind of passion is, when I was training, my very, very first client did looked at pornography maybe every 6 months, but he was so desperate not to have that as part of his life.
Hmm.
And even though he only did it every 6 months, he thought about it and desired it every single day.
Yeah.
Now, on paper, somebody that does it every 6 months is definitely not an addict. So, as I say, my kind of stance on this is very much on don't wait for it to become a problem. Really, really get the help before you get to that point where it really is a problem.
Yeah, I'm kind of come from more of a conservative background, and so for me, I think looking at any of it is crosses the line, and I use what Jesus said in Sermon on the Mount when he's talking about if you look at someone, with lust in your heart, or to commit adultery, in your heart, it's equal to have done the issue, but I know in our society, and I'm assuming it's the same in the UK as it is in the US, that there seems to be like there's kind of a pass for I guess it's called soft porn or just beginning, and it's like it's not that big a deal. Sometimes you need it to spice up your marriage or whatever, but that's not true, is it?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, sin is sin, isn't it? Regardless of what the sin is. But
Hmm.
we've almost made our Christian lives almost like the criminal justice system, where we've got good sins and bad sins.
Yeah.
And, like you say, somebody actually very recently said, oh, it was okay, it was only soft porn. Um, and that doesn't make any difference whatsoever. And I think what we have to remember is quite often we'll downplay lustful thoughts as just being thoughts. Now, we have to remember that the first sin in the Bible was Satan putting an idea into Eve's head,
Hmm.
and it was that thought that led to her committing the sin and basically going against what God had told her. So we have to remember that it might just be a thought or just a desire, but that doesn't mean it's okay. And it's really important to remember that.
What are the driving forces behind porn addiction? I mean, obviously lust, but I mean, there's got to be more to it than that.
So, from a psychological perspective, we've always attributed most addictive behaviors to something that's been driven by attachment issues in early childhood or trauma issues again in early childhood. And that's absolutely true. It's, you know, it's clinically proven. There's lots and lots of, you know, evidence to say that trauma and attachment are major players in the realms of addiction. And I actually really don't even like using the word addiction, but we have a new kid on the block, and the new kid on the block is opportunity. You know, people don't even need to go and look for pornography anymore because it's there. We all carry in our back pockets, we carry pornography, we carry gambling, and it's there at the touch of a button if we choose to do that.
Yeah.
So that creates, it reduces the stigma. You know, you don't have to go downtown anymore to a shop, you know, a long way from where you live and buy a magazine from the top shelf. You can just press a button. You don't even need to pay for content anymore. And that's how people get hooked in. It's just those seemingly unimportant decisions. Oh, it's just soft porn. Oh, it was free. Oh, it only did it for 5 minutes. And yet once that's in, there will be that lure to go back and seek more. But opportunity is playing a huge factor in the increase in this kind of behavior.
I was wondering too. I heard a pastor say this has been 30 years ago, so I don't know if was exactly true then or still true. But he said that 1 in every 4 children were sexually abused in some way by usually by someone they knew, and so if that is the case, that a lot of us listening today were molested or something happened to us when we were younger, doesn't that kind of drive us into these ways of trying to deal with that? Because you said earlier you deal with trauma.
Yeah, I think with people who have experienced childhood sexual abuse, it's very, very, you know, it's a very challenging thing to overcome. And I would say that a small proportion of people who have had that experience do go on to eroticize it and make it something that they feel that they want to go on to explore themselves, and they will then repeat those patterns, like generational trauma. You know, lots of us know about generational trauma, but that absolutely does not mean that everybody that has experienced childhood sexual abuse will go on to commit an offence against a child. Absolutely. True. But what we are seeing is a huge increase in the number of Christians who are convicted for possession of indecent images of children.
Yes.
And that is something that is a massive concern, because although the offence is only possession, within that there is a victim, and there are people who are creating that material on a supply and demand basis. So pornography plays a huge part in suffering, whether it's human trafficking or coercion or the production of child sexual abuse material. Pornography is a major player in those elements.
This has become something I never heard of till the last 15 or 20 years, but you're hearing of it almost daily now. I don't understand it at all. Can you give us some insight into what leads someone to want to view something that involves children? Because I can't relate to that, and I'm not judging anybody. It just doesn't seem human to me.
I mean, I can speak about this from 2 different angles. I have previously worked forensically with offenders who have committed what we call contact offences. And I found that very, very difficult because, like you, I don't have an understanding of it at all. You know, the idea of it really horrifies me. But what I have had increasingly over the last couple of years is walking alongside people who have been convicted or are in the criminal justice system because of they're looking at indecent images of children and child sexual abuse material. And generally that it has a bit of a pathway with anything that isn't good for us. You start off small, and in the realms of pornography, it will be white heterosexual vanilla porn, very, very kind of low key, and as you've referred to, generally referred to as soft porn. But after a while, the hit that you get from that just lessens and lessens. So your body craves more and more, almost like a heroin addict. Nobody starts off overnight injecting a lot of heroin. Generally, the pathway towards drug use generally starts with alcohol misuse, smoking cannabis, before you go on to use what generally termed hard drugs. And it's exactly the same with pornography, where it's a very slow process. And working with people that have been caught for looking at that material, the biggest question they'll often ask themselves is, how did I get here?
Mm-hmm.
And actually, as a psychologist, there's a very clear pathway. But when you're doing it, you don't realize that you're being sucked further and further into it, into that kind of need for that kind of material. But, as I said, what we have to understand is that there are victims in that. And again, that will be a justification very often. Oh, well, it wasn't me that did it. I was just looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
But if there weren't consumers that were willing to, purchase that kind of material or even look at the free content, there wouldn't be a necessity for that to be produced. We saw during COVID, looking at the statistics for
I bet it went really high, didn't
from
it?
IJM, and I think in the UK, the Internet Watch Foundation found that childhood sexual material online increased by 1,000% in 1 year alone. We,
Unbelievable.
as a church, we can't get away from that. We have to prepare ourselves that in 10, 15 years' time, we will have people coming into churches with those experiences
Yeah.
as victims.
Well, and even what we were talking about, the driver of, the Bible clearly teaches us that lust can't be satisfied. So whatever you do at level one doesn't last you long, and that's how it just continues to grow. Is that kind of what I'm understanding you're
Yeah.
saying?
And
Yeah.
actually, we believe all of these lies about certain things will
Mm-hmm.
make us feel good. If you've had a bad day, you'll have a drink.
Mm-hmm.
If you feel like you need to boost your mood, you'll bet on you'll bet on a football game, or you'll bet on a horse racing or something like that, because it does give you a momentary feeling of satisfaction. But that's all it is. It's just momentary, and it's not the lasting satisfaction that we're promised by God.
Mm. And what's driving all this usually is some kind of missing something. It's not about just like for pornography. It's not just about sex or whatever the topic is. It's trying to satisfy a need on the inside. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And, one of the things that is very apparent in the therapy work that I do is that there is a huge blanket of dissatisfaction amongst so many people. Levels of self-esteem are incredibly low. People see other people's lives on Instagram and wonder why they haven't
Yeah.
got that. And I think that, we're more connected than we've ever been as a society ever before. Video calls, being able to talk to somebody in the States. Okay,
Yes.
we're on different time zones, but we don't have a time delay. And we are so connected. But what we're seeing is an increase in loneliness, a huge increase in suicide rates and depression in young people, particularly. So although we're connected, we're very much disconnected. And, people have got, immense levels of dissatisfaction, and people are led to believe that, watch some porn, spice up your sex life. You're not, what you're getting isn't good enough. And we've lost that ability for contentment.
I'm just amazed at the fact that, as pastors, we've uh, we've got to deal with this.
Yeah.
That's why I wanted to have you on, and I continue to talk about this subject, not just from our own personal perspective, but there are so many negative consequences. Like, well, I know that for like if young people who viewed a lot of porn are actually not even able to be intimate with their spouse in their early, 20, 30s. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. One very, very sad thing I hear from young people is because they've become so exposed to pornography that in the younger generation it's really normalized.
Hmm.
Like I said, you don't even have to go and look for it. It's just there in your reels on social media, and programs on TV where people are wearing less and less clothes, that we've become desensitized to what 20 years ago would have not been acceptable.
Hmm.
And the biggest reason that men under 30 in the UK visit their GP or physician is because of porn-induced erectile dysfunction. They've spent their teenage years looking at pornography and believing the lie that I hear so often, I'll stop when I get married.
Yeah.
I hear that so much. And actually, once you get married, you can't stop. If you've had, 8 to 10 years of, getting your sexual satisfaction from pornography, by the time you get a physical relationship with your spouse, you haven't got the ability to do it. And it's really, really sad that young people are going down that belief route of, I'll stop when I get married.
I mentioned to you the other day when we were just talking before today that I remember hearing Dr. Dobson talk about this subject 30 years ago when he did Focus on the Family. And he talked about for a male that seeing those images are almost they're chemically locked in our brains.
Yeah.
And so we could have, is it true we could have like thousands and thousands of images that we can continue to see in our minds?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The brain does store images of certain things, even momentary images, particularly if it's linked to giving you a pleasurable or a negative emotion. So you'll find that somebody who has had a road traffic collision, for instance,
Uh-huh.
will remember the sound and the moment of the impact. And likewise, somebody that has had a pleasurable sensation from looking at particular images or material will associate that image with that pleasurable feeling. So it's really locked into the brain. And, we have a tendency to be able to recall things sometimes invasively, whether we want it or not. And I worked with one particular guy who said that when he was in church on a Sunday and he was in worship, these images would just come back and flood his mind.
During worship.
Yeah.
Was it because do you think it's because of the music or the atmosphere or just the enemy is just attacking him? I mean, what would you think
Yeah,
would cause
I
that?
think it's spiritual warfare.
Yeah, absolutely. I just think about as a pastor, this is probably something you feel like you're over your head at dealing with. And so what I want to do is we're going to take our short break and we come back. I want to talk to you about some ideas or ways or things you could give us advice about to help us begin to deal with this and help people get free. So we'll take a short break and we'll be right back with Hannah. Back here with Hannah now, and just kind of talking through just the effects of really of just having pornography available at any time, anywhere. It's just a different world that we live in now. And for a pastor and someone in ministry, help us. How do we deal with this? Where do we go? I mean, someone comes to me in counseling and says, "Hey, Pastor, I'm addicted to porn. It's affecting my marriage. I don't know how to get free." Where do we go? What do we do?
Um, I think what we also have to understand is that pastors are not immune to this issue themselves.
Yes.
The statistics and the evidence say that, there's a huge proliferation of pastors with this issue themselves who have nowhere to go. I look at it as being, it's almost looking at it from, you've got to take several different angles to work through this problem.
Okay.
Prayer is brilliant. Prayer itself needs other interventions. Therapy itself is brilliant, but there needs to be other interventions. Accountability is amazing, but there needs to be other interventions. So if you can get all of these things working together to really kind of fortify your wall, and it's about building a wall between you and the thing that you want to keep away from.
Mm-hmm.
And, I would always refer people immediately to the work of Covenant Eyes, which I'm associated with. I'm very pleased to be associated with them. And their work is amazing. And not only do they have their porn accountability and software blocking, their software blocking material, which you can put on all sorts of devices. They have so much education and so many programs, both free, I think, and paid for, that you can use as well. Daily support and everything. And accountability is really good, but I think sometimes we have the wrong idea about it. Accountability isn't about saying, "Hello, how are you? Have you had a good week?" It's about asking really challenging questions and getting to the bottom of working with somebody and getting alongside them, because otherwise it just becomes a casual conversation, and that just doesn't work. And I would say, if you're looking for therapy, really try and plug into a specialist in this area. And just in terms of recovery groups, I do know people that have gone to things like Sex Addicts Anonymous. And what we have to remember is that is a secular group.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we're told not to conform to the ways of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And they will potentially have a very worldly view of what's right and what's wrong. which will be very different to our
Yes.
view of what's right and what's wrong. So I would really encourage people to try and plug into some kind of faith-based recovery program. I have an online on-demand one called quit-porn.com. But for some people, they want that because it's on demand, they can do it in their own time. But for other people, they prefer a face-to-face approach, which, and that works. And with my program, what I really like is that once somebody's paid for it, they have lifetime access to it, because very often when I've had people come to me, they've only come because their spouse has said, you've got to go and get help. And actually they genuinely don't, they want to sort of brush it under the carpet and pretend it's not happening. And that's not the right time to try and have some kind of help, because if you're not 100% committed, it's just a waste of everybody's time.
Yeah, absolutely. So here, I want to give you a scenario. Let's say I'm pastoring a small church, a rural church somewhere, and I've heard this podcast. I've heard other conversations about it, and I really do want to set up something to help people in my church. And you mentioned several of those things, but kind of give me an order of what we should do. Should we talk about it from the pulpit? How should we go about handling this?
I think the biggest thing is churches opening up the conversation about pornography and the impact that it's having, not just on marriages, but on families and young children and the youth who are then going to grow up and get married. And if we look at something like suicide, for instance, the biggest impacting thing that can stop somebody ending their own life is to be able to have an open and honest conversation with somebody about suicide. And that's all it takes, is a conversation. It doesn't need, a degree in therapy. It doesn't need specialist qualifications. It just needs the ability for somebody to have an honest conversation and say, is this something that is affecting you?
I think too, as a pastor, we can't just preach about this evil and the sin, and we can't be condemning if we're going to roll this out. Yes, we want to call it out, but we also have got to offer alternatives other than, coming forward in an altar call and getting prayed for. What are some next steps we should do? Like if we do decide that, okay, we want us to have this conversation, and obviously there's all kinds of resources available online, so you can study this however you want to. But you decide to dive into it, and you begin to start that conversation. Should we start a small group, or should we just have counseling available? What are you thinking?
I think do what you are able to sustain long term.
There you go.
There are so many churches that have these great initiatives, and they'll start a recovery group or they'll start something else, and then 6 weeks down the line, the person leading it has got another commitment, so they've had to stop doing it. And I think particularly for this, it can take such a long time for people to open up and talk about it. What I would say is small groups are really good. They're very subject specific, so you can say, look, this is what this particular group is about. What I would kind of err against is making it a deep topic regularly at a men's breakfast, because quite often that's not the place to talk about it.
Gotcha.
Those events are more about building connections with each other. But what is a good idea within that setting is to say, I just want to make an announcement. This is what we're thinking of doing. If you're interested in coming along or helping out with it, then we'd love to hear from you. And it really helps that this subject isn't being pushed under the carpet.
Do you have any success stories of people you've helped?
Yes, I've got a couple, but it's not one of these magic wand healing moments. And I've got two people I know who, the moment they became Christians from very, very challenging and dysfunctional backgrounds, were immediately freed of the desire to look at pornography anymore.
That's amazing.
Which has been amazing. But sometimes it means that people who are really struggling and in the trenches will see that and go, that's never going to happen to me. I've prayed about it and it's never happened. And often that can then be used as a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. What is really, really working is for those people to know that in the moment of temptation, they can reach out for support. and to know that that support is there, prayer support, practical support. And the person I'm referring to in particular is having ongoing specialist help with his issues, which were going back to kind of early childhood, really. So, a 30-year-long journey of pornography.
Wow. Have you had resistance from the church as you've tried to help deal with this subject?
Yeah,
What's that?
lots.
What's that been like?
So someone got in touch through my website about 6 months ago and said, we'd really like to book you to come and talk our event. And then I emailed them saying, this is the kind of the packages I can offer, whether it's just one event or whether it's over a weekend, or and then they sent an email back saying, oh, we're so sorry, we had no idea you're a woman.
Yeah.
And I have extensive specialist training in this area. I'm doing a doctorate in trauma psychology, but I think there are two issues, particularly in the UK. We are miles and miles behind what is the progression in the States, the help that's available in the States.
Yes.
All of my clients at the moment are in the US.
Really?
I don't have any anymore. I don't have any UK clients.
Well, when you talk to churches, is that just the main reason? Is that you're female, or do they just not want to talk about the subject?
That was quite an extreme response, but then I have had similar things from other churches where there's definitely been an element of that, like, why would we invite a woman to a men's breakfast?
Sure.
But it's like, you wouldn't take your child to hospital and say, oh, you can't see that doctor, let's get a man in.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think when I have done events and I have spoken about this at events, the biggest feedback is that, oh my goodness, it was so amazing to hear that conversation.
Yeah. Churches typically don't want to talk about it though, right?
No. And I feel really passionate about opening up the dialogue.
Mm-hmm. So
because it's not going to go away.
Okay, so dive into this. I was going to ask you, why are you even doing this?
What's
your hope?
My prediction, the statistics is not even my prediction. There are more people in churches affected by pornography than there are affected by drugs and alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
And if somebody walks into our church and they have a drug problem, or, it's pretty physically clear that they are abusing some kind of substance, we'll get around them and we'll walk alongside them and we'll get them to food banks and we'll sort out accommodation for them. And there'll be a huge element of wraparound care for this particular person.
Sure.
And yet there are more people affected by pornography than there are by drugs and alcohol. And yet we're not doing anything.
It just seems to me we've got to find a way for churches to address this real issue. And I don't know if I know one.
Yeah. I've got a book being published in August called Quit Porn. You Don't Have to Be Addicted to Want to Break Free. And there's a huge chapter in there about what churches can do to support people that within their churches and outside of their churches in their local community that have an issue with pornography. And at the end of each chapter, there's a QR code linking to free digital resources. Mm-hmm. So I'm really looking forward to putting that together, because I wanted an element of my book to be about supporting people to support other people.
Well, we'll definitely keep that in our show notes. So you're sitting down today with the pastor, and he's like, "I've heard the podcast, and I'm very concerned that I know that we have people in our congregation, just statistically, that have this issue, and we want to help them. What would be his next step or her next step if they're leading the church?"
Really try and talk to the individuals involved to see where they are within what they're facing, and the kind of help that they think would be useful. One of the things I know one particular church did was that they paid 50% of the fees to the specialist therapist for one of their congregation. And that was really nice for him to feel that he had that support from the church. And it's not like, you're palming them off saying, we don't want to help you, but it does need a lot of specialist intervention with certain people in certain areas. But actually with him paying 50% of the fee himself, that gave him an element of responsibility
Sure.
as well, and ownership and accountability. And I think that's quite important.
I
But
think most pastors are just going to feel over their head.
yeah,
And what I've discovered with a lot of us is if something's just too big to deal with, we just don't deal with it. But
yeah,
this situation, and the reason I talk about it on the podcast and had you on and continue to have guests on is it's not going away. It's
no,
and it's
no,
already there. And so
yeah.
I think I'm imagining we should at least we're going to have some way of confidentiality to help people come forward
Mm.
without being exposed. Is that correct?
Um, I one of the first sermons I did on this subject, the church actually said to me, "Okay, look, you can talk about mental health, but don't do the whole sermon about pornography. But you can have the last 30 seconds to talk about pornography." And so I did that because it's their church and I
Mhm.
was a guest. And after the service, 9 people came forward to talk about pornography and how it was affecting them. Now, to you, 9 people in a congregation sounds nothing because you have churches in the States that fill stadiums, don't you? But this was a church
The
with a
majority
congregation.
don't, though.
This was a church with a congregation of less than 60 people,
Uh,
and 9 people came forward at the end. And it was just amazing to be able to say, look, to kind of link those guys up. But then I was doing some work with another church where there were 4 people in the congregation and none of them wanted to know about the other, that not wanted anybody
sure.
else to know about them. And we have to be respectful of that, which is why getting professional help from a therapist is really good. But one of the things that I found is that once the conversation is opened up and it has that snowball effect,
Mhm.
if you know that somebody else from your small group is fighting this battle, you're more likely to put your hand up and say that you are as well. But it's when it's hidden and it's underground and so stigmatized that nobody wants to say anything.
Yeah, this is a tough issue, but we've got to be prepared to deal
Yeah.
with it, and we've got to be proactive at dealing with it. It's not going away. It is affecting our churches. It's certainly affecting our young couples, and I'm
Yeah.
imagining it's even just pretty much anybody. It's a plague that has
Oh,
gone on, and it's just got to be dealt with. I really appreciate that you take the time to do this, that you have such a passion to do this. What is your hope at the end that you could help accomplish?
I'll answer that in a minute because I was just going to finish off about pastors. It's important to remember that as a pastor, you don't have to bear this burden alone.
Yes.
You have your eldership team and you also have the accountability of your eldership team. And that's really important to remember, is that in order to look after yourself, you have to share the burden of your pastoral responsibilities. But back to what's my hope? My hope really is to open up conversations about pornography, whether it's in churches or in communities. My hope is that more people come forward to get the help that they need. But also, I have a real passion for supporting women, not just women who are the spouses of somebody using pornography, but women who are drawn towards pornography
I
themselves.
was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
There's an emerging market for pornography produced specifically for women. It's actually written off as being self-care.
Yeah.
That's what it's called now.
Mm.
Female masturbation is called self-care. um, but women who have a spouse who is using pornography are often left feeling that it's their fault.
Hmm.
If I had less weight on my body, then he wouldn't look at pornography. If I was younger, he wouldn't look at pornography. And actually, the stigma of that and the shame attached to women and marriages is really, really chronic. And I have a real heart for women who are just left abandoned by this.
Jesus came to set us free, and we
Mm.
can walk in freedom. And so uh, you don't get free unless you deal with the issues, though.
Yeah,
You got to
yeah,
dive in and deal with them.
yeah. And dealing with all of it, not just cherry picking some bits and hiding the rest of it away in the hope that you can cling on to it.
Yeah. I really appreciate you taking the time to be with me. I'm glad we connected. I'm going to put the links to the things that you have offered, to your book, everything. We'll put the links in the show notes, and so that people, if they want to follow up, and I'll put your email as well, that people can connect with you. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, and I pray that you're just able to help a lot of people.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me, Dale.
Thanks for listening to the 95 Podcast. We look forward to sharing another episode with you next week. In the meantime, visit our website at 95network.org. The website is loaded with great resources created for small and mid-sized church leaders. Until next time, have a great week.